That's a lot of rock and roll. Hi, it's Mr. Fulton, and this cool little graphic, and it is probably the most educational um, timeline of rock and roll out there. How many of you thought that all of those songs were rock and roll that you listened to? But in fact, all of those songs were rock and roll songs. Rock and roll gets its start in the United States of America very early on. And because of that, and because it was not marketed very well for many different reasons in the early 1900s, it has taken many different shapes and forms. Pre 1900s, that time in America was a very volatile time. Let's think about this for a minute. We had just come out of the Civil War. In fact, I just saw a picture the other day in 1911 of all of the remaining Civil War soldiers meeting back at the Battle of Gettysburg who survived and shaking hands. And so that was in 19, I believe, 11, maybe 1917, if I'm mistaken. Civil War was still on everybody's mind, even in the early 1900s. Prior to the Civil War, remember that we had slavery. So we're not very far removed at this point from having slaves from other countries. And what does that have to do with rock and roll? Well, the blending of cultures after the 1900s caused there to be an explosion of different kinds of music to where now we have all of this stuff down here. So let me talk you through this. In the gray are things that aren't really considered rock and roll, but they are considered things to have helped rock and roll become what it is. So spirituals, work songs, hymns, gospel, classical music, jazz, big band, country, swing. I also lump blues into not really rock and roll. Anything in orange or this yellow color, depending on how you see it, that's going to be the cultural music that blends in with blues and rhythm and blues to become more rock and roll centric. Cultural music here came from mostly families of slaves. These orange or yellow again colored tabs, these come from people who are either European based or another country. So like Mexican folk, Hawaiian folk, Appalachian, that's European or at least Eastern United States, Anglo-Celtic, meaning Ireland, Scotland, bluegrass, which also comes from Anglo-Celtic, and Western music. In the 1900s, we had the invention of jazz, or 1910s. Anyway, we had jazz appear. And then boogie woogie came out of the blues, and country came out of all of this Western music. So the big three in the 1910s and 20s were country, boogie woogie, and jazz. Can you imagine that? Plus all of this type of stuff. Hawaiian folk music was a big thing in the 1920s and 30s. Then we had big band come from jazz, swing came from big band, and you mix that with country music, you get Western swing. Blues became electric blues and then jump blues. Avant-garde is a different type of music where there's not really, it's sounds and sound effects, and we'll get into that later. And finally, you mesh all of this stuff together and you get something called rhythm and blues. Well, what is rhythm and blues? It's the very first name of rock and roll, and anything that came out of rhythm and blues is going to sound a little less rock and roll and a little bit more jazz, swing, country, and Western. But then after 1950, you see that rock and roll takes off, and you get rockabilly, ska, skiffle, doo-wop, beat music, surf music, blues rock, garage rock, folk rock, soft rock, psychedelic rock, roots rock, hard rock, boogie rock, all of this type of different kinds of rock music. And then in the 80s, it really takes off and goes a totally different direction to where it becomes, rock and roll actually becomes part of the rap culture in the 1980s and 90s. So as we look at different kinds of rock and roll music, what I'd like you to do in the next section is I want you to pick one kind of music in the 1950s and back. So not anything after the 1950s, but starting with rhythm and blues and going back to some of the earlier music. I want you to take a kind of music and I want you to write just a small little blurb about how you think that played into the creation of rock and roll.